everybody, I'm Nancy. My channel, A Square Pillow Isn't Square, is the place where you will find anything and everything you wanted to know about home deck sewing. So I'm here at home today. We have a nice cloudy day where I don't have a lot of backlight, so I thought, let's just talk about a couple of the little Roman shades I have here in my house. And I'm not going to teach you how to make one in this video. I'm just going to tell you the things to think about and understand before you make your Roman shade. So the first of our 7 tips that we are going to talk about today is tip number 1, which is to choose the right fabric. So many times I've seen people choose Roman shade fabric and it's just not an appropriate fabric to make a successful Roman shade. So let's just start with what are the kinds of fabrics you want to avoid. The first kind of fabric you want to avoid is something that is really, really soft and drapey and lightweight, as this one is. It's beautiful, it feels like butter, but it doesn't have enough stability to make a nice Roman shade. The second type you want to avoid is a very open weave fabric. Your strings, your mechanisms are going to show through. A lot of open weave fabrics like this are also not very stable. They'll tend to stretch out. So that's something that you want to avoid. And the third kind of fabric you want to avoid is something really thick. Upholstery fabric that is strictly for upholstery, not a multi-purpose home deck fabric, but a thick upholstery fabric is not going to make a good Roman shades. It's just going to get too thick as your shade is raised and your pleats stack onto themselves. It's just going to be too thick and bulky. So what's the right kind of fabric to pick? Any type of medium weight, tightly woven, stable fabric. That is light duty upholstery fabrics, multi-purpose home deck fabrics that are suitable for drapery or upholstery, or tightly woven cottons, cotton blends, drapery weight fabric that you'll find in the home deck store. All of these kinds of fabrics are going to be good candidates for your Roman shade. Very quickly about lining. Make sure you choose the appropriate lining as well and watch out for the pitfalls of blackout lining on Roman shades. If you want to know more about the right kind of lining to choose for your project, please watch my video. It's actually going to be called Drapery Lining Part 2, which will help you choose the right lining and avoid some pitfalls and mistakes that you may come across if you don't choose your lining correctly. Tip number 2, extend your hemline below your first fold. A lot of places will just have you turn up a small little hem at the bottom and start your shade rings near the bottom of the shade. One of the most important things I want you to understand about why that's not a good way to do it is because if you put rings at the bottom of your shade and you pull up your shade, these rings are going to come up the back. So now what happens is as you pull up your shade, you're going to just have a series of folds like this on your raised Roman shade. That looks really pretty. What's wrong with that? The reason that this is not a good way to do your hem is that UV light and sunlight is always going to come through the glass below the shade. Over time, the UV rays are going to fade the fold lines that are exposed to the light. So the farther that you go back on the shade and the more light that hits the bottom of this shade, the more these folds are going to fade. Then, when you drop your shade, over time, you're going to have a series of faded horizontal lines across your shade, and they're going to be more faded and more noticeable the lower the shade is. And the higher the shade is, where the folds are more protected, they're going to get smaller and less faded, and you're going to have to remake your Roman shade. So, if you want your shade to last a really long time and look good for a really long time, you are going to want to make a really deep hem. Right now, I have a very small hem showing at the bottom of my shade. This is only about an inch or an inch and a half. The reason it's this small is because I was using some leftover scraps of fabric to make my 2 shades, and I was being a little chintzy. In a perfect world, you're going to want to have a 2-inch at least a 2-inch visible hem showing at the bottom of your shade. That means that your first ring is going to be half of the distance of your ring spacing. So if these rings are sewn 8 inches apart, my folds will be 4 inches. I want 2 more inches to show, so my first row of rings on the back should be 6 inches from the bottom of the shade. Tip number 3, keep your projection or the distance between your wall and the front of your shade as small as possible. The important thing to think about when you're mounting a Roman shade, though, regardless of if it's a board or if it's a curtain rod, is how far it projects from your wall. Unlike curtains and draperies that have a return or that come around a rod and can cover this gap here, Roman shades obviously are flat and just hang off the front of whatever you're mounting them from. And because the farther away you mount a shade from the wall, the bigger this gap is going to be. That is going to decrease your privacy, perhaps. It's also going to increase the amount of light that comes in through the side of the shade. So the most important thing to think about is keeping a very close projection. As I said, I like to use the closest mounting board possible. In most cases, I will use a piece of 1x2 whitewood board from any boxed home improvement store. Really inexpensive. Just make sure you look for a nice straight one with no warps in it or whatever. And I will wrap it in a piece of fabric so that even though it's a close mount, you can still see the end of it. I just like to make sure that that coordinates, matches my fabric, so it just doesn't become a noticeable element at all. So in summary, keeping your projection small and close to your wall will increase your privacy. It will decrease the amount of light that comes through on the sides of your shade, and it will reduce your ability to see up inside to the top of the mounting board where you're going to see the mechanisms and the screw eyes and your tension lock. The closer you go to the door, the less likely you're going to be able to look up inside there and see all that stuff you don't want to see. Tip number 4, adjust your vertical ring spacing to be appropriate and proportional to the length of the window you're covering. The next thing people are never sure about is how far apart to sew your rings on. You know, videos will say space your rings 6 inches apart, 5 inches apart, 8 inches apart, 10. Why? What difference does it make? The spacing has to do really with just one thing. How big, how deep do you want your folds? There's no real exact perfect right answer. In general, the longer your shade is, the farther apart you want your rings to be. The reason for that is if you have lots of small folds and you have a big long window, you're going to have a stack of fabric at the top that has twice as many folds as this, and it's going to just start, as you can see on the side, it kind of creates a fan shape as the bulk of the fabric sort of stacks onto itself. You're going to have this huge stack of folds that ends up being practically horizontal, if not more, if you have rings that are spaced close together on a really long shade. So I kind of just figure it by scale. I'd say on the high end, you can space your rings 10 inches apart, even 12 inches apart. If you want really deep, if you want fewer deep folds, you can space them as far as 10 or 12 inches apart, and then your folds will be 5 or 6 inch folds, which is a really nice depth on a long window. We're going to go to another window in a minute, and I'll show you smaller folds because it's a smaller scale window. So on this one, I probably figured about 3.5 or 4 inch folds. So these are probably 7 or 8. My rings are probably 7 or 8 inches apart. And I think that's a really nice scale and a really nice number of pleats for this long door that we've got here. All right, and here we have my other little door in this area in my house. You can see this window's a lot shorter. I wanted to make sure that when this shade was raised, it still had a nice number of folds visible. So instead of doing, 8-inch ring spacing or 4-inch folds like I did on the other door, I made them smaller on this door. There may be only, I'd say, between 5 and 6-inch ring spacing, which gives me 2.5 to 3-inch folds. Tip number 5, always use all white on the back of your shade. As you can see in this picture from the outside, when that shade is lowered, if I use everything white, you do not see the rings, the cords, the knots, you don't see anything. It all just looks nice and clean and white from the outside of the house. If you have ivory lining and white strings and gold rings, it is not going to be an attractive look from outside of the house. And you should always think about how good it looks from the outside as well as how good it looks from the inside. So always use white. Tip number 6, make sure you space your rings horizontally, the correct distance apart. Okay, the other thing is how far apart to put your rows of rings. A lot of tutorials will just say space them this many inches apart. Well, it's never really that simple. It just depends on a lot of things. If you have a very lightweight fabric that is not super stiff and stable, you're going to want to space your rings, your rows of rings a little bit closer together so you don't get little swoops in your fabric. If you've got a thicker fabric or really strong, stable fabric, you can space them farther apart. In general, you never want to go past about 10 inches. I've done 10.5, 11 on a stable fabric before and it's worked okay, but I've gone anywhere from 8 inches apart on my vertical rows, but I average about 10 inches, I'd say, apart on my vertical rows. Always err on the side of more than you think you need versus less than you think you need. And tip number 7, don't be skimpy on your hem that you turn up on the back of your shade. And as you can see, I have a nice 6-inch hem here. A full hem up the back of your face fabric is you've got your fabric and you've got it folded along the back. I've got my first row of rings sewn at that point, and because I have so much fabric here with my hem, I can sew this ring through multiple layers of fabric and it's going to be a super strong and durable point of stress because those bottom rings take most of the stress and work when you're lifting your shade. So it's nice to have extra layers, extra stability for your first row of rings. All right, so now you know all the things to think about before you even start to cut or sew your Roman shade. I hope you found this video, are you coming up again? I hope you found this video helpful. If you liked it, please consider subscribing to my channel. I have lots of other good information here with lots more to come. If you have any questions or something you didn't understand, please just ask me or comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching and happy sewing.